Hi, Katy Ricalde coming to you from Cleveland, the site of the GOP convention. I'm here with Stephen Olikara, founder of the Millennial Action Project. Stephen, nice to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Why don't you tell me a little bit about the Millennial Action Project?
Well, the question that we're trying to answer with the Millennial Action Project is how will this new generation of leaders, the Millennial Generation, govern America? In an era of polarization and gridlock, we're trying to foster cooperation among young Democrats and Republicans and independents. We started the nation's first ever youth caucus in Congress. It's called the Congressional Future Caucus, and we now operate in 13 state legislatures. It's become a movement, and I'm very excited. People tend to be despairing when they read the headlines, but I work with these leaders every single day, and they're making a tremendous amount of change.
Tell me what members of Congress are involved. Is it both sides of the aisle?
Yeah. Our co-chairs are Congressman Will Hurd on the Republican side and Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard on the Democratic side.
Now, a lot of times the young people, the millennials, don't turn out to vote.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, the problem is that a majority of millennials don't believe that politics can solve the problems that we're confronting. And if we don't see impact and results coming out of the political system, then there's less incentive to participate. But there's often a misconception here, because millennials at the same time have the highest levels of service participation in the United States. We have the highest levels of giving, time, and volunteering to causes. So the problem is that we want to make change and we're idealistic, but our politics and governmental system is not delivering. So that's the gap that we need to close, is the idealism to civic engagement gap.
How do we do that?
Well,
people have been trying for years. Politicians have been trying for years.
Well, what I always say is we need not just a new generation of social entrepreneurs who are making a difference in the private sector, but a new generation of political entrepreneurs who are trying to make our political system work better. Millennial Action Project is one example of that, and we see tremendous results. Like just here in Ohio, a few weeks ago, our Future Caucus co-chair, State Senator Frank LaRose, enacted one of the first online voter registration bills in the country, and that's going to help a lot of millennials register to vote.
What do you say to young people, though, that say it's not worth my time,
right,
it doesn't really matter because I live in a state that always goes blue or always goes red? You know, I mean, here in Ohio, we're in a swing state,
yeah,
so it's a little bit of a different story. But what
right,
do you say to those people who live in, you know, South Carolina or a state that is, you know, tends to just go one way?
Well, what I would say to them is that the United States is an experiment in democracy, and it's only here because those who came before us were willing to sacrifice not only their money and time, but in many cases their lives. And so it is our civic duty to at least vote at a minimum. But more importantly than that is work in all sorts of ways, whether it's running for office or being involved in the non-governmental sector, to make our democracy work better. The second thing I would say is that we need to bring compromise back. You know, James Madison, who was one of our nation's youngest founding fathers, said that cooperation and diversity is the solution to faction. If we have different groups working together, we have the most chance of advancing the public interest. And I'm convinced that we have the solutions within our generation, and if we participate more, we'll see better results.
But I will say, a lot of times you hear the millennial generation referred to as the narcissistic generation, the me generation,
right, and
while it's great to talk about civic responsibilities, sometimes that doesn't always register with them. We live in an age of social media, everything is online, they need to be excited in some way, shape, or form. So do you think it's the duties of these politicians to get out there and to try to excite the, you know, the youth base?
100%. It's the responsibility of the current elected officials, and by the way, both political parties want the millennial vote. We're the largest generation in America, and if they want to succeed in the 21st century, they need to not only have a new message, but also new tactics and new ways of communicating to us. Being online is a good example of that. You know, so many things we do with the government just seem so outdated. We need to upgrade our government. You know, we're the generation that's brought Uber and Lyft and the sharing economy. Government has been stuck in reverse in many ways on those types of issues. So the current generation needs to work better, but also the responsibility falls on us. You know, we have people in their 20s and 30s who are in state legislatures who've enacted the first state laws to embrace the sharing economy in a bipartisan way. So these things are happening. The responsibility falls on all of us.
Now, Bernie Sanders, I know he obviously no longer in the race,
Right.
but he did very well with millennials, and
Right.
they really flocked to him. I mean, why is it that this elderly white senator from Vermont was able to rally all of these young people in a very unique way? If you look at his Instagram account and things like that,
Right.
I mean, you had the hashtag Bernie for Babies for Bernie and creative things like that that young people follow, but
Right.
he didn't post nearly as much as some of the other candidates on social
Mhm.
media. Why, do you think that he has such a following?
Well, I think there were two things. One is the authenticity factor. We live in an era where we do not trust our government. Approval ratings of Congress is down to around 10%, which is the lowest record ever in our nation's history. We don't think that government works. So when we don't trust our politicians and we think they're corrupted, here comes Senator Sanders, who didn't have a super PAC and who also spoke from his heart. And I always say millennials have a good BS radar, and we can always call it out. And so we could see that Bernie, whether he agreed with him or disagreed, he was speaking and he meant what he said. The second thing is that he was diagnosing some critical problems facing our generation. And he spoke to that very authentically. He spoke to the rising inequality. He spoke to the environmental disaster that we're going to inherit. He spoke actually very credibly to the issue of money and politics reform. I really hope that supporters of Bernie Sanders can actually come together with supporters of Donald Trump on the issue of money and politics reform, because Sanders and Trump were the most active and the most effective, I believe, in calling out the corruption that super PACs are and that big donors have in our elections.
Now let's talk about the Harvard poll that
Yes.
came out on Sunday. Hillary Clinton in this new Harvard poll had 60% unfavorability rate among millennials. Donald Trump, however, has a 74% unfavorability among millennials. And just touching on what you said a few minutes ago about Bernie Sanders and how he spoke freely, Donald Trump has been known to speak freely, but
Right.
do you think that young people don't feel that he has that authentic voice that Bernie Sanders is delivering? Why are these numbers so high for both of these candidates?
Yeah, well, I would say among millennial Republicans, actually, they do see that authenticity. Donald Trump actually received more youth votes than John McCain did or Mitt Romney did. So he actually overperformed. He overperformed among many demographics, actually, in the Republican primary, including millennials. So I do think that there was some millennial Republicans who saw that. But here, to your point, is the problem, is we're choosing between the lesser of two evils. And their unfavorability ratings are the worst of any two major party candidates in American history. So we have to disrupt the current paradigm. We need to enlist a new generation of leaders who are public-oriented, who can inspire the country. This sort of choice that we have, I think, should be a false choice. And that's why even the third-party candidate, like Libertarian Governor Gary Johnson, is actually overperforming a bit among the millennial demographic.
Yeah, that Harvard poll mentioned that as well.
Yeah.
And how do you think that will play out? When you guys go out and talk to young people, do you find that Gary Johnson excites them?
Absolutely. I've been hearing that from both Republican and Democratic millennial voters, to be honest. And what's interesting, if you look at the polls without Johnson and then the ones with him, he, for the most part, evenly siphons votes from both Clinton and Trump. So it's very exciting. I actually think he will reach the threshold to enter the debates because of all these reasons, because people are so dissatisfied with the choices that are available to us.
Great. And finally, I just want to ask you one more thing. What are your goals going forward, since we are just a few months away? We already have our Republican nominee that was chosen last night, and we will have the Democratic nominee this time next week. What are your goals with Millennial Action Project going forward?
Well, our goal is actually to deliver the message that you can make a difference in politics. Right now, less than a third of millennials see public service as an appealing career track. And yet, across the country, we've seen millennials enact the first sharing economy legislation, the first online voter registration bills, the first crowdfunding legislation for startups. Millennials who want to start businesses, they can now raise money peer-to-peer. So you're seeing solutions across the country, and we want people to know that politics can work if you participate. Here are some examples. Then we're also looking ahead of the election. because we're going to have the first 100 days of the new presidency, and that's a real opportunity for real governance to happen. That's the time when we can legislate, and I'm convinced that our future caucuses across the country are going to be in position to make a big difference.
Great. Well, Stephen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really nice to meet
Appreciate
you,
it.
Stephen Olikara with the Millennial Action Project. That's it from Cleveland.